What happens when a powerful state attorney becomes the victim of a racially charged wrongful arrest? A prejudiced officer's split-second decision ignites a firestorm, unraveling secrets, systemic corruption, and a fight for justice that shakes an entire city. As protests erupt and the truth surfaces, one question remains: will accountability finally prevail? Don't miss this gripping tale of courage, reform, and the unrelenting pursuit of equality. The sun hung low over Asheville's bustling downtown, its golden rays glinting off glass windows and casting long shadows along the sidewalks. Xavier Marshall stood outside the Bramblewood Cafe, his tailored blazer and polished loafers setting him apart from the casual weekend crowd. He scrolled through his phone, pausing occasionally to glance at the cafe's entrance, waiting for his coffee order. There was no urgency in his posture, just a man enjoying a quiet Saturday morning. Across the street, Officer Paul Riker sat in his patrol car, engine idling. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as his gaze locked onto Xavier. Something about the man felt off. The polished appearance, the quiet confidence, it didn't fit. Riker's gut churned, his instincts firing on all cylinders, though no tangible reason came to mind. "You don't belong here, do you?" he muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening around the wheel. Riker had seen Xavier walk down the street earlier, his strides purposeful, his chin held high. It was the kind of confidence that, to Riker, felt like a challenge. He'd been patrolling this area for years, and he thought he knew the types that belonged and those that didn't. Something about Xavier triggered an unease in him that he couldn't shake. From his vantage point, Xavier appeared calm, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to Riker's scrutiny. But to Riker, that calm was suspicious. People didn't just stand around looking so comfortable. The sound of a car horn jolted Riker momentarily from his thoughts. The world around him was alive with activity. Tourists snapping photos, kids holding ice cream cones, shop owners setting up outdoor displays, but none of it mattered. His attention snapped back to Xavier, the man now glancing at his watch and tucking his phone into his pocket. "Who are you waiting for?" Riker murmured, his suspicions deepening. In Riker's mind, he wasn't profiling Xavier. No, this was instinct. Years of experience had taught him to trust his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him that Xavier didn't belong. He had to act. He pushed open the car door, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. The leather creaked under his grip as he crossed the street, his eyes never leaving Xavier. Xavier looked up just as Riker approached, his expression neutral but aware. It wasn't the first time he'd been approached by a cop for simply existing in public, and he doubted it would be the last. "Morning, officer," Xavier greeted, his tone calm but guarded. "Morning," Riker replied, his eyes narrowing. "What brings you to this part of town today?" Xavier raised an eyebrow, gesturing toward the cafe. "Just grabbing some coffee. Is there a problem?" Riker's gaze swept over Xavier, noting the expensive blazer, the gold watch glinting on his wrist. The details only served to deepen his suspicion. "Mind if I see some ID?" Xavier exhaled softly, keeping his posture relaxed. He'd played this game before. His tone remained steady as he asked, "Have I done something wrong, officer?" Riker's jaw tightened. The question felt like a challenge, one he wasn't prepared to entertain. "Let me see your ID," he repeated, his voice firmer this time. A few bystanders had started to notice the exchange. A woman holding a shopping bag paused mid-step, her brow furrowed in curiosity. Two men at a nearby table glanced up from their conversation, their eyes flicking between Xavier and the officer. Xavier nodded slowly, reaching into his pocket with deliberate care. His movements were measured, each one calculated to avoid escalating the situation. He retrieved his wallet and handed over his ID without a word. Riker snatched it, his eyes scanning the card. "Xavier Marshall," he read aloud, his tone laced with skepticism. "What's your business here, Mr. Marshall?" "I told you," Xavier replied evenly, his voice betraying no irritation. "I'm getting coffee." Riker's lips pressed into a thin line. The ID was clean, the address respectable, but it wasn't enough to shake his suspicion. He handed the card back with a grunt but didn't move to leave. "You're just standing here," Riker said, his tone accusatory. "Looks like loitering to me." Xavier's calm facade wavered slightly, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "Loitering? I'm waiting for my order. The receipt is in my pocket if you'd like to see it." Riker's eyes narrowed, his fingers twitching by his belt. His unease wasn't rooted in logic. It was something deeper, something he wouldn't admit even to himself. "You don't look like you're waiting for anything," he snapped. The tension thickened. A man walking his dog slowed as he passed, glancing over his shoulder at the unfolding scene. A teenager sitting on a bench pulled out her phone, angling it discreetly to record. "Officer," Xavier said, his voice calm but firm, If there's nothing else, I'd like to get back to my morning. But Riker wasn't ready to back down. His frustration simmered just beneath the surface, his grip on authority slipping the longer Xavier maintained his composure. He stepped closer, his presence imposing. "Turn around," Riker ordered suddenly, his voice sharper than before. Xavier's heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me?" "I said turn around," Riker barked, his hand moving to his radio. The moment hung heavy in the air. Xavier glanced around, noting the growing number of onlookers, their expressions a mix of concern and outrage. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral. He'd seen the headlines, heard the stories. One wrong move could mean disaster. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong," Xavier said carefully. "This is unnecessary." But Riker wasn't listening. His patience had snapped, his assumptions taking control. He reached out, grabbing Xavier's arm with unnecessary force and pulling him toward the brick wall of the cafe. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. "What are you doing?" someone shouted, but Riker ignored them. The roughness of the wall scraped against Xavier's blazer as Riker pinned him in place. The handcuffs clicked into place with a metallic finality, the cold steel biting into Xavier's wrists. Xavier winced, his shoulder protesting the movement, but he remained silent. He wouldn't give Riker the satisfaction of a reaction. Behind them, the murmur of the crowd grew louder. "He didn't do anything," a woman yelled. "Why are you arresting him?" Riker's grip tightened as he turned to face the onlookers. "Back off," he barked, his voice cutting through the commotion. "This is police business." But the crowd wasn't backing off. Phones were raised, cameras recording every second. A woman in a blue dress shouted, "You'll regret this when you find out who he is." Riker's jaw clenched. He turned back to Xavier, shoving him toward his patrol car. "Get in," he ordered, his voice cold. Xavier stumbled, his injured shoulder sending a jolt of pain through his body. He caught himself, glancing once more at the growing crowd before stepping into the car. As the door slammed shut, the sounds of the street were muffled, replaced by the low hum of the patrol car's engine. Xavier leaned back against the seat, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The murmurs of the small crowd on the bustling street outside Bramblewood Cafe grew louder, the tension in the air palpable. Officer Paul Riker's sharp commands contrasted with Xavier Marshall's calm composure. The metallic clang of the handcuffs snapping shut still hung in the ears of those watching. "Turn around," Riker had barked moments before, his voice heavy with authority and irritation. Xavier had complied, his shoulders squared, his movements deliberate. Even now, with his hands bound tightly behind him, there was an undeniable air of dignity about him, one that refused to bow under the weight of Riker's aggression. "Loitering," Riker repeated as if trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "You've got no business here standing around like this." Xavier turned his head slightly, his voice even. "Officer, I've explained myself. I'm waiting for my coffee order, that's it. I have the receipt in my pocket if you'd care to see it." But Riker wasn't listening. His assumptions had hardened into certainty, and in his mind, Xavier's calmness was an affront, a refusal to submit. The gathered onlookers, now numbering about a dozen, were restless. A woman with a stroller stopped mid-step, shielding her toddler from the growing scene, but unable to tear her gaze away. Two young men leaned against a lamppost, their phones raised to capture the interaction. "This is ridiculous," one muttered to the other. "It's the third time this month I've seen something like this happen here." Riker yanked Xavier's arm, guiding him away from the cafe's brick wall toward the patrol car parked across the street. Xavier stumbled slightly, his ankle twisting on the uneven pavement, but he quickly steadied himself, refusing to show weakness. "You're making a mistake," Xavier said, his voice steady but firm. "Oh, I don't think so," Riker shot back, tightening his grip. "People like you always think they're above the rules." Xavier's lips pressed into a thin line. The words were like a slap, but he knew better than to react. He glanced at the growing crowd, noting their concerned faces and raised phones. The tension in the air was suffocating, and he could feel the eyes of the onlookers burning into his back. "Hey!" a man's voice broke through the murmurs. "What's he even done?" Riker whipped his head around, his irritation flaring. "Back off!" he barked, his free hand gesturing toward the bystanders. "This is a police matter." "It doesn't look like he's done anything," the man continued, his phone held high. "Why are you cuffing him?" The challenge sent a ripple through the crowd, emboldening others. "This isn't right," a woman added, her voice trembling with outrage. Riker's jaw clenched. "Everyone step back!" he shouted, his voice reverberating off the surrounding buildings. But the crowd wasn't backing down. Phones continued to record, and the air buzzed with whispered outrage. Xavier turned his head slightly toward Riker, his voice calm but cutting. "You should listen to them, officer. You're drawing attention, and not the kind you want." That was the final straw. Riker shoved Xavier harder than necessary toward the patrol car, the sharp motion jarring his shoulder and sending a lance of pain down his arm. Xavier winced, biting back a groan as his wrist twisted awkwardly in the cuffs. "Get in," Riker ordered, his tone colder than ever. Xavier hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the crowd. A woman near the front, her face a mixture of anger and desperation, shouted, "You're going to regret this when you find out who he is." Riker froze for a split second, her words cutting through his haze of frustration. But he quickly brushed it off, pushing Xavier toward the open car door. "I'll decide what I regret," he muttered under his breath. The patrol car's interior was stifling, the leather seats sticking to Xavier's back as he leaned into the silence. His mind was racing, not with panic, but with quiet determination. He had learned long ago that control was key in moments like this. Outside the car, the crowd was growing more vocal. The woman who had spoken earlier pointed a finger at Riker. "You don't even know what you've done, do you?" she said, her voice steady now. Riker shot her a glare before slamming the door shut, muffling the cacophony of voices. He strode around to the driver's side, his movements rigid with barely concealed anger. Inside the car, Xavier let out a slow, measured breath. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, meeting Riker's hardened gaze for just a moment before the officer looked away. The tension in the air was palpable as Riker gripped the steering wheel and started the engine. The voices of the crowd faded into the background, replaced by the low hum of the car's movement through the city streets. For a few moments, there was silence. Then Xavier spoke, his tone measured. "You know this isn't going to end well for you." Riker's hands tightened on the wheel. "Keep quiet," he snapped. Xavier leaned back, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't smiling because he found the situation amusing, far from it. But he knew something Riker didn't. And soon, Riker would know it too. The precinct was a cacophony of ringing phones, the murmur of voices, and the occasional clatter of paperwork. Officer Paul Riker strode through the entrance, his jaw set, one hand gripping Xavier Marshall's arm as if the man were a dangerous criminal. The thud of the heavy door shutting behind them cut through the noise, drawing a few curious glances from nearby officers. Xavier, calm but slightly hunched from the pain in his shoulder, stepped forward without resistance. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the faces around him. The precinct was an all-too-familiar setting, chaotic, transactional, and laden with tension. But today, he was the one in cuffs, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Riker guided Xavier toward the booking desk, his grip unnecessarily tight. "Suspicious behavior," Riker muttered as they approached the officer seated behind the desk, loitering near a cafe, refused to cooperate. The booking officer raised an eyebrow, glancing between Riker and Xavier. "Loitering?" he asked, his voice skeptical. "Yeah," Riker snapped, standing around like he had nothing better to do. "I'll file the report." Without waiting for a response, Riker shoved a clipboard into the booking officer's hands and moved toward his desk, leaving Xavier in the custody of another officer. Xavier said nothing, his eyes steady, observing the room with quiet intensity. At the edge of the room, Officer Sarah Morales adjusted her name badge and stood with a stack of reports in her hand. A relatively new recruit, Morales was known for her sharp instincts and careful attention to detail. She watched the interaction from a distance, something about Xavier catching her eye. Morales hesitated, her mind trying to place the familiarity she felt. His face, his demeanor, something about him tugged at her memory. She stepped closer, setting her reports aside. "Who's that?" she asked the booking officer, nodding toward Xavier. "Some guy Riker brought in," he replied with a shrug. "Loitering, he says." Morales frowned. "He doesn't look like the loitering type," she murmured. She approached Xavier, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. He turned his head slightly as she neared, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her pause. His calmness was striking, almost unsettling in a situation like this. "Sir," she began, her voice low, "are you okay?" Xavier nodded once. "As okay as one can be, given the circumstances," he replied evenly. His voice, steady, articulate, and laced with quiet authority, sent a shiver through Morales. She glanced at the cuffs on his wrists, then at the faint lines of pain etched across his face. Something about him didn't add up. "Hang tight," she said softly, stepping away toward the booking desk. She picked up the clipboard with Xavier's information and scanned it quickly. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the name, Xavier Marshall. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the clipboard down, her mind racing. She had seen that name before recently. It didn't take long for the pieces to click into place. The news article, the photograph, the state attorney. "Oh my God," she whispered under her breath, her heart pounding. Morales leaned against the desk, trying to process the gravity of what she'd just realized. Xavier Marshall wasn't just another civilian, it was the Xavier Marshall, the newly appointed state attorney, a man who wielded immense power within the very system they served. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto Riker, who was seated at his desk, scribbling furiously on a report. Morales felt a surge of panic. Did Riker have any idea what he'd done? She turned back to Xavier, who stood quietly by the booking desk, his posture impeccable despite the cuffs digging into his wrists. He wasn't pleading, wasn't protesting. He was simply waiting, as if he knew the weight of the truth would soon catch up with everyone in the room. Morales bit her lip, her thoughts swirling. She needed to act, but how? Confronting Riker would undoubtedly escalate the situation. He wasn't the type to take kindly to being challenged, especially not by a rookie. On the other hand, bringing this to Captain Dana Harris could unleash a storm within the precinct. She clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the decision bearing down on her. Every second she hesitated, the situation spiraled further out of control. Morales glanced back at Xavier, who gave her a subtle nod as if to say, "You know what you need to do." Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and walked briskly toward Captain Harris's office. The captain was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and strict adherence to protocol. If anyone could take control of the situation, it was her. But as Morales reached for the doorknob, she hesitated. Her pulse quickened as a thought crossed her mind. What if Harris didn't believe her? What if this escalated beyond her control? Behind her, Riker's voice rose as he discussed the report with another officer. Morales turned to see him gesturing wildly, his frustration evident. The scene only solidified her resolve. She pushed open the door to Harris's office, her heart pounding. The captain looked up from her paperwork, her sharp eyes narrowing at the intrusion. "Morales?" Harris said, her tone clipped. "What's this about?" Morales stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Captain, we have a situation," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves clawing at her throat. "The man Riker just brought in, he's not who Riker thinks he is." Harris arched an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "Go on." "It's Xavier Marshall," Morales continued, her voice lowering. "The state attorney." The silence that followed was deafening. Harris's expression didn't change, but the intensity in her eyes deepened. She leaned forward, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "You're certain?" Harris asked. "Yes, ma'am," Morales said firmly. "I've confirmed it. His ID, his demeanor, it's him." Harris exhaled sharply, rising from her chair. "This is going to be a problem," she muttered, more to herself than to Morales. Morales nodded, her heart still racing. "What should we do?" Harris grabbed her blazer from the back of her chair and stepped toward the door. "We fix it, now." As they exited the office, Morales felt a strange mixture of relief and trepidation. The storm was coming, and it was about to hit the precinct with full force. The tension in the precinct was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officers moved about their routines with a sense of unease, their glances darting toward the booking area where Xavier Marshall sat, silent but unyielding. Across the room, Riker sat at his desk, scribbling furiously on his report, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. The door to Captain Dana Harris's office slammed open, her sharp heels clicking against the tile floor as she strode toward the holding area. Officer Sarah Morales followed close behind, her face pale but determined. Whispers rippled through the room as Harris's commanding presence cut through the usual din. "Riker!" Harris barked, her voice carrying over the hum of conversations and ringing phones. Riker's head snapped up, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before it hardened into a defensive mask. He rose slowly, his posture stiff. "Yes, Captain?" Harris stopped a few feet from him, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "I need to speak with you, now." Riker hesitated, glancing around at the curious faces of his colleagues. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone laced with irritation. "Let's take this to my office," Harris said, her voice like steel. But before she could turn, Xavier's calm voice cut through the air. "Captain Harris, if I may." All eyes turned to Xavier, who sat with his back straight and his hands still cuffed in his lap. Despite his injuries, there was an undeniable aura of authority about him. Harris turned toward him, her sharp gaze softening slightly as she took him in. "You have something to say, Mr. Marshall?" she asked. "I do," Xavier replied, his tone measured. He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of the officers watching him. "But I think it's important everyone hears it." Harris paused, her jaw tightening. She motioned for Morales to unlock Xavier's cuffs. Morales hurried to comply, the click of the lock echoing in the tense silence. Xavier rubbed his wrists briefly before standing, his height and presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "I'll keep this brief," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I was unlawfully detained and physically harmed by an officer who acted on prejudice rather than evidence or protocol. This isn't just an affront to me, it's an affront to the justice system." Riker's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Prejudice?" he scoffed. "You were loitering, acting suspicious." Xavier turned to face him fully, his gaze steady. "Waiting for coffee while scrolling through my phone is not suspicious behavior, Officer Riker. You demanded my ID without cause, escalated the situation when I complied, and used excessive force to detain me." The room was silent. The weight of Xavier's words hung heavily in the air, each accusation cutting deeper than the last. "I remained calm," Xavier continued, "because I've seen how quickly situations like this can spiral. But make no mistake, that doesn't mean I'll stay silent about what happened here today." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of admiration and unease. Harris turned back to Riker, her expression unreadable but her anger barely contained. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Officer Riker?" Harris asked, her voice low and dangerous. Riker stammered, his usual bravado faltering. I was just doing my job," he said defensively. He matched the description of— "Stop!" Harris interrupted, holding up a hand. "Do you even realize who you arrested?" Riker blinked, his confusion deepening. "He's just some guy loitering?" "He is Xavier Marshall," Harris said, her voice sharp. "The state attorney." Riker froze. The color drained from his face as the weight of her words registered. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind him, the officers exchanged uneasy glances, the implications sinking in. Morales, standing slightly behind Harris, folded her arms, her expression a mix of frustration and satisfaction. Harris stepped closer to Riker, her voice dropping to a near growl. "You assaulted and detained one of the most powerful legal figures in this state, all because you let your bias guide your actions. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've just made?" Riker's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his desk, his mind racing. "I didn't know," he muttered weakly. "That's the problem," Harris snapped. "You didn't think. You acted on assumptions, and now we're all going to pay the price for your recklessness." As Harris's words echoed through the precinct, the sound of a phone vibrating broke the tension. Morales glanced at her phone and paled. "Captain, you need to see this." Harris took the phone from her, her eyes narrowing as she watched the video playing on the screen. It was the footage of Xavier's arrest, captured from multiple angles by bystanders. The video showed Riker grabbing Xavier roughly, shoving him against the wall, and snapping the cuffs on his wrists, despite Xavier's calm compliance. The video had already gone viral. Comments flooded the screen, each one more damning than the last. "Another abuse of power. This has to stop. How many more times will we see this?" Harris handed the phone back to Morales, her expression grim. She turned to the room, her voice rising. "Listen up. This precinct is now under intense scrutiny. There will be an internal investigation into this incident, and I expect full cooperation from every single one of you. Am I clear?" The officers nodded silently, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "Riker," Harris said, turning back to him. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon." Riker's jaw dropped. "Captain, you can't—" "I can," Harris interrupted, her tone final. "And I will." As Riker fumbled with his badge and holster, the room buzzed with murmurs. Outside, the faint sound of chanting grew louder. Harris moved to the window and pulled back the blinds, revealing a growing crowd of protesters outside the precinct. "They know," she said softly, almost to herself. Xavier stepped beside her, his voice low but steady. "This isn't just about today, Captain. This is about systemic change. What happens next matters more than you can imagine." Harris nodded slowly, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She turned back to the room, her voice cutting through the noise. "Morales, coordinate with legal and prepare a statement. The rest of you, get back to work. This precinct isn't shutting down today." As the officers dispersed, Harris locked eyes with Xavier. "Mr. Marshall, I'd like to formally apologize for what happened to you here today. It was unacceptable." Xavier inclined his head. "I appreciate that, Captain, but apologies won't be enough." Harris nodded. "I know, and I'll make sure we do better." But as she said the words, the sound of the protesters outside grew louder, their chants echoing in the hearts of everyone inside. The sounds of chanting echoed through the thick glass windows of the precinct, growing louder with every passing hour. Protesters spilled onto the streets, their voices unified in outrage. Signs bearing messages like "Justice for All" and "No More Police Brutality" waved high above the sea of people. What had started as a small gathering was now a full-blown demonstration, and the atmosphere crackled with tension. Inside the precinct, Captain Dana Harris watched the crowd from her office window, her face set in a grim line. The people outside weren't just angry, they were organized. Civil rights groups had quickly mobilized, and prominent leaders were already making their way to Asheville. This wasn't going to blow over. Down the hall, Officer Sarah Morales sat at her desk, nervously scrolling through social media. Every platform was flooded with clips of Xavier Marshall's arrest. The footage was damning. Riker's aggressive tone, the unnecessary force, Xavier's visible injuries. The hashtags were trending. #Justice for Xavier, #Stop Police Brutality, #Accountability Now. This is bad, Morales murmured to herself, her stomach churning. The media had seized on the story with fervor. National outlets were running headlines like "State Attorney Arrested Without Cause" and "Systemic Racism Exposed in Asheville Precinct." Xavier's name and face were everywhere, and the narrative was clear. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a broken system. In the break room, a small group of officers huddled together, their voices low but heated. "I'm telling you, Riker was just doing his job," one officer muttered. "That guy was acting suspicious. We're supposed to ignore that?" "Suspicious," another officer shot back, her tone incredulous. "He was waiting for coffee. You think that's grounds for what Riker did? Open your eyes. This is exactly why people don't trust us." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The divide within the precinct was becoming more pronounced with each passing hour. Some officers defended Riker, clinging to a misguided sense of loyalty, while others sided with Harris and Morales, acknowledging the need for accountability. At the center of it all, Riker sat in a small interrogation room, his head in his hands. His suspension had been swift, and now he was under review by Internal Affairs. The reality of his situation was finally starting to set in. His badge, once a symbol of authority and respect, now felt like a weight around his neck. The door opened, and his union-appointed lawyer, Martin Graves, stepped inside, a folder tucked under his arm. Graves was a sharp, no-nonsense man with a reputation for defending even the most indefensible cases. "Paul," Graves began, taking a seat across from him, "we need to talk about what's coming next." Riker looked up, his face pale. "They've got the video," he said, his voice hollow. "It's everywhere. What am I supposed to do?" Graves sighed, opening the folder. "We're going to fight this, of course, but let me be clear. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The videos, the witnesses, the injuries. This isn't going to be easy." Riker leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "I didn't mean to hurt him," he said weakly. "I was just following my instincts." "Your instincts," Graves repeated, his tone sharp. "Your instincts have landed you in the middle of a national scandal. And let me remind you, the man you arrested isn't just anyone. He's the state attorney." Riker's face twisted in frustration. "I didn't know!" Graves leaned forward, his eyes cold. "That's the problem, Paul. You didn't know and you didn't think. Now we're going to have to dig you out of this mess, and frankly, I don't know if that's even possible." Meanwhile, Xavier Marshall sat in a quiet conference room at his legal firm's office. His arm was still in a sling, a reminder of the physical toll the arrest had taken. Across the table, his trusted legal team worked tirelessly, sorting through documents, reviewing the footage, and preparing their case. "Xavier," said Michael Rivers, his lead attorney, "this isn't just about you anymore. This case is shaping up to be a landmark moment in the fight against police misconduct. Civil rights groups are reaching out, offering their support. We've got the evidence, the public backing, and the legal grounds to take this all the way." Xavier nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "I don't want this to just be about one bad officer," he said. "We need to address the system that allows officers like Riker to act with impunity. That's what this case needs to be about." Rivers leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's exactly what we're going to do." As the day wore on, the protests outside the precinct grew larger. Civil rights leaders arrived, delivering impassioned speeches that fired up the crowd. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras capturing every moment. Inside, Harris paced her office, her mind racing. The pressure was mounting, and she knew the department's response would define its future. She grabbed her phone and dialed the police chief. "Chief," she said as soon as he answered, "we need a plan. This isn't just about Riker anymore. The entire department is under fire." On the other end of the line, the chief sighed heavily. "I know, Dana. I've been fielding calls all day. We need to issue a statement, something strong, something definitive. I agree, Harris replied, but we also need to act. An internal investigation isn't enough. We need real reform and we need to show the public we're serious about it. The chief was silent for a moment. Do what you need to do, he said finally, but tread carefully. The whole city is watching. Harris hung up and sat at her desk, her gaze drifting to the window. The protesters were still there, their voices rising in unison. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. That evening, Xavier's legal team held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on Xavier as he stepped up to the podium. His presence was commanding, his voice steady as he addressed the nation. What happened to me is not unique, he began. This is the reality for countless individuals who face systemic bias and injustice every day. But this time, we have the opportunity to make a difference. I am filing a lawsuit against Officer Paul Riker and the Asheville Police Department. This is not about revenge. This is about accountability and change. The room erupted in questions, but Xavier remained calm, his resolve unwavering. The announcement sent shockwaves through the precinct, the city, and the nation. For Riker, it was the final blow. Sitting alone in his small apartment that night, he watched the press conference on TV, his face pale and drawn. The reality of his situation was undeniable. He was at the center of a storm that would change everything, and it was only just beginning. The Asheville Municipal Building buzzed with a tense energy as people filed into the public hearing room. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras trained on the high table where 5 panel members sat, representing internal affairs, the city's legal department, and the police union. Beneath the fluorescent lights, a sense of gravity hung over the room. This wasn't just another disciplinary hearing, it was a reckoning. In the front row, Xavier Marshall sat in silence. His posture was impeccable, his arm still in a sling, a visible reminder of the injuries he had sustained during his wrongful arrest. To his left, Michael Rivers, his lead attorney, leafed through a thick file of evidence. To his right sat leaders of prominent civil rights organizations, their presence a clear message. This hearing wasn't just about Xavier, it was about systemic change. At the opposite end of the room, Paul Riker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His once confident demeanor was now replaced by visible unease. His union-appointed attorney sat beside him, whispering advice, but Riker's eyes remained fixed on the polished wood of the table in front of him. All rise, a clerk announced as the panel entered the room. The members took their seats, their expressions unreadable but stern. Captain Dana Harris followed, standing off to the side, her gaze sharp and watchful. The lead panelist, a tall, gray-haired man named Commander Ethan Reed, adjusted his glasses and spoke into the microphone. This hearing is now in session to review the conduct of Officer Paul Riker during the arrest of Mr. Xavier Marshall on charges of loitering. We will hear testimony from all parties and review the evidence before rendering a decision. Let's proceed. The first portion of the hearing was procedural, a recitation of events, the charges, and the rules of conduct. But when Xavier was called to the stand, the atmosphere shifted. The room fell silent as Xavier stood and approached the witness table. Despite the physical pain evident in his movements, his steps were deliberate. He adjusted the microphone, looked up at the panel, and began to speak. "My name is Xavier Marshall," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I am the state attorney for this jurisdiction. But my role in this city does not exempt me from the realities faced by many others, realities rooted in systemic bias and discrimination." A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced as Xavier continued. "On the day of my arrest, I was waiting outside a cafe, doing nothing more than checking my phone. Despite this, I was approached by Officer Riker, questioned without cause, and ultimately detained using excessive force. My injuries, this sling, the twisted wrist, are not just physical. They are a manifestation of a larger issue." Xavier's voice remained calm, but the weight of his words filled the room. He described the arrest in vivid detail, his tone measured but unyielding. He painted a picture not of a momentary lapse in judgment, but of a systemic problem, one that allowed bias to dictate actions. "I complied," Xavier said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I remained calm. Yet I was treated as if my presence alone was a threat. This isn't about me. It's about the assumptions and prejudices that shape interactions like these every day. I am fortunate to have the platform to speak about what happened to me, but many others do not." A hushed silence followed his statement, broken only by the faint clicking of cameras. Even the panel seemed momentarily caught off guard by the depth and precision of his testimony. Reed cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Your statement will be entered into the record." Riker shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the panel turned their attention to him. Officer Riker, Reed said, his tone sharp, you may now present your account of the events. Riker's lawyer nudged him, and he rose to his feet, his movements stiff. He approached the microphone, his hands gripping the edges of the podium, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. I was just doing my job, Riker began, his voice shaky. Mr. Marshall was standing outside the cafe, and he looked suspicious. I followed protocol. I asked for ID, and when he resisted... Resisted? Xavier interjected, his calm voice cutting through Riker's stammering. Is that what you call compliance? The room murmured again, and Reed banged his gavel lightly. Mr. Marshall, you will have an opportunity to respond. Officer Riker, continue. Riker cleared his throat, his confidence faltering further. It wasn't personal, he said defensively. I was following my instincts. Instincts, Reed repeated, leaning forward. Instincts that led to physical injuries, a baseless arrest, and now, national outrage. Explain how those instincts align with department protocol. Riker opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. The viral videos, the medical reports, and the public backlash had already rendered his defense paper thin. He turned toward his lawyer, but even Graves seemed resigned to the inevitable. The panel called several witnesses, officers, bystanders, and experts, all of whom painted a damning picture of Riker's actions. By the time Xavier was allowed a rebuttal, the tension in the room was unbearable. Xavier rose again, his expression resolute. This hearing isn't just about me, he said. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those tasked with protecting the public do so without prejudice or bias. Officer Riker's actions are a symptom of a larger problem, and unless we address that problem, this cycle will continue. His words landed like a hammer. Even those in the room who had initially sympathized with Riker found themselves grappling with the undeniable truth of Xavier's statement. After hours of testimony, Reed leaned into his microphone. The panel has reviewed the evidence and heard the testimonies. Based on our findings, Officer Paul Riker is hereby suspended without pay, pending further investigation. The department will also initiate a comprehensive review of its training and protocols to address the systemic issues brought to light during this hearing. The room erupted in murmurs. Riker slumped in his seat, his face pale and drawn. He stared at the table in front of him, the weight of his suspension pressing down like a boulder. Xavier, meanwhile, remained composed. As he stood to leave, a reporter called out from the back of the room. Mr. Marshall, what's next? Xavier paused, his hand resting on the back of his chair. He turned toward the crowd, his voice steady. This is just the beginning. There's a system that needs changing, and I intend to see it through. The words hung in the air, a promise that resonated far beyond the walls of the hearing room. The precinct was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The usual bustle of officers and the hum of daily operations had been replaced by hushed conversations and lingering tension. The fallout from the hearing was palpable, but Captain Dana Harris was not one to let the silence fester. On a crisp morning, she stood in the precinct's largest briefing room, facing a crowd of her officers. Her expression was stern, her tone resolute. We cannot allow what happened to define us, she began, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The actions of one officer have tarnished the reputation of this department, but we have a responsibility to rebuild that trust, with the public and with ourselves. Behind her, a large monitor displayed a series of slides outlining the new protocols she was implementing. Harris pointed to the first slide, the words, anti-bias training, mandatory and ongoing, displayed in bold letters. Every officer in this department will undergo rigorous anti-bias training, Harris announced. This isn't a one-time session, it's a continuous effort to ensure that prejudice has no place here. Murmurs rippled through the room, some officers nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Harris noticed but pressed on. The second reform, she continued, clicking to the next slide, is a complete overhaul of our use of force protocols. De-escalation will no longer be a suggestion. It will be a requirement. Lethal force will only be permitted under the strictest circumstances, and every use of force incident will be subject to independent review. The room fell silent. The weight of her words was undeniable. Finally, Harris clicked to the last slide, the words transparency and accountability displayed in stark black and white. We are establishing a civilian oversight committee, she said, her voice steady. This committee will review complaints, conduct investigations, and ensure that our actions are held to the highest standard. We must earn back the trust of the people we serve. As the meeting concluded, Harris stepped down from the podium, her gaze sweeping over the room. This is not optional, she said. Change is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. Across town, Xavier Marshall sat in a crowded community center surrounded by activists, local leaders, and concerned citizens. His presence alone was enough to energize the room, but it was his words that galvanized the crowd. "This isn't just about one incident," Xavier said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about creating a system where accountability isn't optional, where justice is more than a promise." The applause was thunderous. Representatives from civil rights organizations and advocacy groups leaned forward, taking notes as Xavier outlined his vision for statewide reform. "Change starts at the local level," Xavier continued, "but it doesn't stop there. We need to push for policies that ensure officers are properly trained, that misconduct is met with real consequences, and that our communities feel safe, not targeted." As the meeting progressed, Xavier's leadership became a rallying point. His calm demeanor and thoughtful approach made him a respected voice in the movement. The community began to see him not just as a victim, but as a leader, someone who could turn outrage into action. One of the attendees, a young organizer named Maya, approached Xavier after the meeting. "Your story has inspired so many people," she said. "How can we help you take this to the next level?" Xavier smiled, his resolve evident. "We work together. This isn't my fight alone. It's ours." Meanwhile, Paul Riker's world was unraveling. The disciplinary hearing had marked the beginning of the end. With his suspension in effect and a pending lawsuit hanging over his head, Riker found himself ostracized by his colleagues. Even those who had once defended him were now keeping their distance, unwilling to be associated with the fallout. In his small, sparsely furnished apartment, Riker sat in front of his laptop, scrolling through news articles about himself. The headlines were merciless. "Officer at center of controversy faces suspension. Abuse of power exposed. Disgraced cop sparks calls for reform." His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from reporters seeking comment, others from people spewing vitriol. The isolation was suffocating. For the first time, Riker began to confront the depth of his actions. He replayed the arrest in his mind, remembering every decision, every moment where he could have made a different choice. His assumptions, his biases, they had all been laid bare. But it was too late to salvage his reputation. His name had become synonymous with misconduct, his career in law enforcement effectively over. Riker glanced at a photo on his desk, a picture of himself in uniform, standing proudly next to his parents. The pride he had once felt was now replaced by shame. Back at the precinct, Morales approached Captain Harris with a stack of files. Her expression was serious, her voice quiet. "Captain, we've uncovered something," Morales said, placing the files on Harris's desk. Harris opened the top file, her eyes scanning the pages. It was a report detailing a pattern of complaints against several officers in the department. Excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct. It was all there. "This isn't just about Riker," Morales said. "There's a pattern here, a culture that's allowed this to go unchecked." Harris leaned back in her chair, her face grim. "How far does this go?" "Far enough," Morales replied. "And if we don't act now, it's only going to get worse." Harris nodded, her mind already racing. "Prepare a report for the Oversight Committee," she said. "We're not sweeping this under the rug. If we want to rebuild trust, we start here." As Morales left the office, Harris stared out the window at the city below. The protests had quieted, but the work was far from over. In the community center, Xavier received a phone call from Rivers. "Xavier," Rivers said, his tone urgent, "we've found something. A pattern of misconduct within the department. This lawsuit is about to get a lot bigger." Xavier's grip on the phone tightened. "Good," he said. "It's time to shine a light on the whole system." The stage was set for the next battle. A fight not just for justice, but for lasting change. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, activists, and community members who had followed Xavier Marshall's case from the beginning. The atmosphere was electric, anticipation thick in the air as the judge took her seat. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room collectively stood. Xavier sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Michael Rivers and a team of seasoned attorneys. Across the aisle, Paul Riker sat alone with his lawyer, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. The weight of the trial had worn him down, and the steady march of damning evidence had left his defense in tatters. The judge began, her tone solemn. "After reviewing the evidence, hearing testimony, and considering the arguments presented, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Xavier Marshall." A ripple of applause broke out in the gallery, quickly stifled by a stern look from the judge. "The court orders Officer Paul Riker and the Asheville Police Department to pay damages," the judge continued. "Furthermore, the department is directed to implement comprehensive reforms, as outlined in the plaintiff's demands." Xavier exhaled deeply, his composure steady despite the waves of relief washing over him. This wasn't about the money. It never had been. This was about justice, about accountability, and about the possibility of change. Hours later, Xavier stood on the steps of the courthouse, a podium set up for him to address the crowd that had gathered. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed in his direction, and the eyes of the nation were on him. "This victory," Xavier began, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd, "is not mine alone. It belongs to every person who has ever felt the sting of injustice, to every community demanding accountability, and to every voice that has called for change." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. "This case is a reminder," he continued, "that justice is not automatic. It requires vigilance, courage, and the willingness to speak out, even when the odds are against us. Today we've taken a step forward, but there is still so much work to be done." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing off the surrounding buildings. Xavier raised his hand, calling for silence. "Reform is not a destination, it's a journey. And that journey requires all of us, citizens, leaders, and officers alike, to hold each other accountable and to strive for a system that truly serves and protects everyone." His words were carried live on national television, and within hours, they had sparked conversations across the country. Social media was flooded with calls for action, and other communities began organizing their own initiatives for police reform. In the weeks that followed, the Asheville Police Department underwent a transformation. The Civilian Oversight Committee was established, anti-bias training became mandatory, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct was implemented. Across the state, other departments began adopting similar measures, inspired by the changes in Asheville. For Riker, the fallout was devastating. Stripped of his badge, his career in law enforcement was over. His name had become synonymous with the very issues the nation was now working to dismantle. He lived in quiet isolation, grappling with the consequences of his actions and the biases that had led him there. One evening, Xavier sat in his living room, his arm fully healed but his mind still restless. He gazed at the sling that had once immobilized his shoulder, now folded neatly on a nearby shelf. It was a relic of a painful chapter in his life, but also a reminder of how far they had come. His phone buzzed, a message from Michael Rivers lighting up the screen. "The reforms are working, Xavier. Complaints are down, and community trust is up. Thought you'd want to know." Xavier smiled faintly, but his thoughts drifted. He knew the fight was far from over. Systemic change wasn't achieved overnight, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. The city lights stretched out before him, a tapestry of possibility. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of life, voices, laughter, footsteps. Xavier closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The scars of the past lingered, but they no longer weighed him down. Instead, they fueled his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who believed in a fairer, more just world. The journey would continue, but for now, Xavier allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that together, they had taken the first steps toward something better. As we close the chapter on Xavier Marshall's journey, his fight for justice serves as a powerful reminder of the impact one voice can have in challenging systemic issues. But his story also leaves us with important questions to reflect on. Do you think the reforms implemented by the police department are enough to create meaningful and lasting change? Or is there more that needs to be done? If you were in Xavier's position, what would you have done differently during or after the arrest? What steps can we, as individuals, take to ensure accountability and fairness in our own communities? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that matter. Together, we can keep the conversation going.